Hey, my name is Dawson and welcome back to That 70s Renovation. I just finished installing all of the drywall in my garage. Let me show you how I did it. A few disclaimers to get started. This was my first time installing drywall, so if you're a professional watching this, please give me some grace. And if you are a newbie thinking about doing a DIY drywall project, I would suggest getting a friend. I did it by myself and it was actually kind of hard, but not impossible. So here's how it went. I first started by hanging the ceiling, and I posted about that in my last video. I completely messed it up, so I'm not going to share it again in this video, but the same concepts apply to the ceiling and the walls for the most part. So once I got the ceiling up, I did a top row of drywall. I started with the top because I wanted to get the seam as tight as possible between the wall and the ceiling. If you started on the bottom, it would be a lot harder to get that top seam looking good. Before you hang any pieces of drywall, you really need to make sure there's no screws or anything popping out that would get in the way. I had to kind of clear out this spray foam insulation around the new door that I put in, and there were actually a couple surprise nails that I had missed along the way. So definitely make sure you triple check every wall that it is ready for the drywall. And if you're going to cut the drywall, it's super easy. You just need a utility knife and a straight edge. You cut through the top layer of paper and then fold the drywall, and it pretty much just cracks along that line, and then you cut through that second backing layer of paper and you're good to go. I had to do a couple custom cuts like around this doorway, and probably the hardest part about doing drywall is the patience it requires. It took me a lot of tries to get this cut completely right around just this doorway, which is actually a pretty easy cut. And then imagine, how many times it takes to cut around water pipes and all this kind of stuff. So definitely take some patience with you when you're starting this project. When I hung up the ceiling, I used a drywall lift that I rented for the day, and that made it really easy to hold the drywall in place while I screwed it. But the walls were a little bit harder because I was holding the drywall up and trying to screw it and trying to get it in the right place all at the same time. And that is really hard to do by yourself. A little bit later on in this video, I'll show you how I ended up using scrap 2x4s to make some braces that could hold the drywall up for me with the top row while I screwed it in, and then I made some blocks out of 2x4s to hold the bottom pieces up while I screwed it in, and that was honestly a game changer. But I still want to show you these videos because I feel like sometimes with YouTube tutorials, it can be really discouraging when it looks like it's going so great for all the professionals, and then you try the project and it's a complete catastrophe. And that's kind of how I felt while I was trying to do this first row of drywall. But a little persistence never hurt anybody, and I was able to get this whole first wall installed. And I will say the top was a lot easier to hold up by yourself than the bottom. You don't have as much leverage when you're holding it up from the bottom, and it's hard to see exactly where it should be lining up. So it took me a couple tries to get these bottom pieces screwed in. And because it was really hard, I did have some bigger gaps on this wall, but honestly, nothing too crazy, and it can all get fixed with the tape and mudding. After I had a board on the wall, I would put in most of the screws except for the last row, and I would wait until I had the next piece of drywall up on the wall to do that last row of screws. Because when you're screwing in that close to the end of a drywall, sometimes the gypsum, which is the white material in between the two pieces of paper, can blow out of the side of that drywall if there's a screw really close to the edge. So if you have your two pieces of drywall already touching each other, it's not really a problem because the gypsum will just run into the other piece of drywall and it doesn't cause any issues. So I did the middles first and then did the ends last. Around my new laundry room area, I did need to add some extra supports. The new wall that I added was not directly on a stud, and so there wasn't anything for the ends of the drywall to screw into. I just ended up using some scrap pieces of wood to create a new ledge there for the screws to go into, but there might be more professional ways to do it. That's just how I ended up doing it. One other tip, if you are putting drywall on a wall that already has outlets in it, make sure that you unscrew them a little bit from the box so that you can pull them through. I made this mistake a lot of the time. I would put the piece of drywall up with my hole already cut and then realize that I couldn't get it out right in there because the outlet was blocking it, so then I would have to take the drywall down, unscrew the outlet, and then put the drywall back up, fish it through, etc. So just make sure you unscrew that before you get started. I got pretty lucky on this side of the garage when I went to hang my lower row of drywall. It needed to be just about a ½ inch off of the ground, so I used a scrap piece of drywall, rested my new piece on that, and then screwed it in. Look how much better the seam is here than on the other wall where I was holding it up at the same time. This little wall for the water heater was super unlevel and wonky, and I decided to try out this idea to make it really easy to get a perfect cut on that wall. I started by installing just an entire sheet of drywall. It was a little bit closer to the ground here, so I ended up using a doormat instead of that extra piece of drywall, and I put a couple screws in just to hold it in place. Then I grabbed my razor blade and came over to the front of the closet and used that 2x4 as my line to cut along. And this made a perfect cut on my drywall that precisely matched the wonky wall. This was such a cool trick that I ended up using it a couple more times in the garage, so keep an eye out for that. But I think it was an easy way to get that perfect cut, and it was kind of like scribing a piece of wood in woodworking. This water heater did used to have a door, but it was so nasty I ended up just taking it off and throwing it away when I removed all the drywall. But I will need to figure out how to rebuild that, and if you have any good ideas on the best way to do that, please leave them in the comments below. I'm not sure if it needs to have ventilation or something like that, so I'm gonna have to do some research and maybe put up a louver door or something like that. But yeah, let me know in the comments if you've built something like this. Cutting around outlets can be so annoying, but I found this really cool tool online, which is almost like a magical magnet drywall tool. And here's how it works. You put the piece inside of the outlet, and then you put on your drywall, and it has a second yellow magnet piece that finds that outlet precisely and gives you a line to cut around. Here's how it worked in action on my new laundry room closet wall. I put that thing in the outlet, put my drywall up, and then this just magnetized right to where it was. I drew a little Sharpie line and then cut it out with my razor blade, and it was such a good cut. I have messed up so many pieces of drywall by mismeasuring or just getting it in the wrong spot, and this is almost like a foolproof way to make sure you know exactly where the hole is and where it should be. I will link it for you in the description below. It comes in a pack of 3, so if your wall had 3 outlets in it at once, you could use the whole set and make sure you don't even need to measure anything when you put up your piece of drywall. I think it's a pretty cool tool. Let me know if you give it a shot. I really learned on this project that you should not throw away any pieces of drywall. It might feel like it in the moment, like there will be no use for it, but I can't tell you how many times I went to my little scrap pile of drywall and found something that fit exactly the right size of the space I was working in. For example, I cut off this little piece from my laundry closet wall, and it was almost exactly the right size for this little part of the front of the wall. So I just screwed it on and then did my same little trick to trim off the back of it, and it was a perfect fit. Whenever I get to the finishing stages of this project, I'm gonna add a corner bead to this outside corner wall. It is either a piece of plastic or metal, and I guess you could also use the paper tape as well. But essentially, it will just strengthen the corner of this drywall, and that would help if anything ever bumped into it. It would help protect it from denting, and it also gives you a really clean surface to do the joint compound to. If you haven't seen my other videos from this renovation yet, I actually built this little laundry closet area. The laundry machines are in the garage at this house, which isn't ideal for me as someone who likes to do projects because I don't want the laundry machines to get super dusty and everything like that. So I built this little enclosure that will have doors and hopefully keep the laundry a little bit more protected and less messy in the future. If you're gonna do a drywall project, please give yourself grace. That is my biggest tip. I made so many mistakes when I was cutting around the water lines for the laundry, the natural gas, the dryer vent, the electrical, all of this kind of stuff, and I was getting so discouraged. But the great thing about drywall is it's not too expensive, and it's okay if you make a mistake because you can just pull it off the wall and try again. Or in the case of this dryer valve, I just flipped the piece of board upside down and then cut a new hole and patched the old one. Drywall is super easy to work with, so don't worry if you make a mistake, you can probably fix it. Now here's where I started to actually use my brain. I used a scrap 2x4 and screwed that into the studs of the wall, and that held up the weight of my drywall while I screwed it into the wall. Now it did take me a couple tries to get this 2x4 screwed in exactly where it needs to be. Drywall is 48 inches tall, and so I measured that far down and screwed it in initially, but the ceiling doesn't always line up perfectly and it's not 100% level, so I had to adjust the 2x4 a couple times to get it in the right place, but once you do that, it makes everything so much easier. And one thing I didn't get a video clip of is you will have to likely trim all your pieces of drywall. You want to make sure that your drywall starts and ends on a stud in the wall. Drywall comes 8 feet long, and sometimes your studs don't match up with that. So for example, that first piece of drywall, I had to cut like 4 inches off of so it would fit onto a stud. And my last cool tip for you is making blocks to hold up that bottom piece. I ended up using a couple 2x4s and actually scrap pieces of drywall in between them to make the perfect height for my block. Now the floor was sloping towards the grass, so I ended up having to adjust the size of that block as I went along, but it held up perfectly and made that process so much easier. I learned so much while doing this project, and there's definitely something to be said about practice makes perfect. That last wall that I did looks so much better than the first wall that I did. I'm pretty proud of how this turned out for my first time installing drywall, and I've learned a lot that I can take with me the next time I do something like this. The next step of this project is going to be filling all of the seams and screw holes with joint compound, and then doing a couple coats of that just to make it all super smooth and looking nice. And then I can finally move on to priming and painting. So make sure you're subscribing so you don't miss any updates from that 70s renovation. Thanks for watching.